I'm going to present a talk that me and a friend of mine called Miana had during DEF CON. It's about a offline access control system that fails to do any sort of authenticity validation of the data that is stored on the credentials. Some of you might already be wondering what is an offline access control system, and to explain that, it's easier to first explain what an online one is. So an online access control system is a system where the database server, or the database/server, has essentially a direct connection all the way down to the card reader. So when you come up with the credential, you'll present the credential to the reader. The reader will send it up to the controller, and the controller will ask the database server some sort of infrastructure if you have permission to enter through this door. For some installations, it might not be practical to have everything online. So what they did was, what's been done in a couple of cases is, instead of then having the data stored on a centralized point, you store the access conditions on the credentials. And then the door is supposed to validate those credentials if you have access to this door. So in this case, the data will travel from the server down to an encoder of some sort onto your credential, and then that will be validated on the door. So what we did was we looked into some of these because we're hackers and we like to look at things. And there is mainly one tool for this. That is what they call the Swiss Army knife when it comes to RFID tokens. It's called a Proxmark. It has the same size as a credit card, just about. It's a bit thicker. But this can be used to ask credentials for details and stuff like that. So we use this tool to then be able to use a very known exploit within the MIFARE classic credentials, which the offline access control called SmartAir, which I am presenting the vulnerability for today, is using to store and transmit data around the system. So it's gotten to the point now where MIFARE Classic is so broken that someone made a command called autopawn within the tooling. Because, well, apparently it's that easy now. After you run the autopawn command, you get essentially all of the keys, unless it's a very specific card. It will be vulnerable to one of the 5 attacks it attempts to run against the credential. And yeah, as you can see here, we had a few credentials, or I had one credential to begin with. And this is what it outputted with a bunch of keys to read the data from the different sectors, and then, yeah, spits out everything in a bin file. So we started to look into those credentials. I made a few. I have about 150, it's probably more now, of different types. Because I got the demo installation and went on eBay and found some parts and ended up having a full access control system at home. Never intended for that to happen, but well, that's what. I then started looking at things and I noticed something. I made one credential which just had access to one door. And this is part of the dump and not the full dump, of course. And then I made another one where I told it, well, I want access to 3 doors. And then I saw, well, it seems to only be adding 4 bytes per door. That's interesting. So this is the situation we had. We had 3 doors. I had access on all 3 doors, but the 5th, the IDs here are from 2 to 5. So I've had access to all of the doors, but this last door that I had in my installation. So I thought, oh well, what happens if I do this? Well, still rejected. Okay, good. It works as intended. There must be some sort of signature. Oh, no. It's just there's a different part of the card that tells it how many doors it should attempt to read from the card. So once we found that, we changed that to 4 instead of 3, and then we had access to the last door. So, and that's like, this is the type of system we're looking at. Does it remind you of anything? Like Windows 98 kind of team? So we got a hold of some software as well. There were some public box.com links that were referred to from some manuals. So with a bit of Google foo, you were able to get the installation up and running with the demo license. So we started to experiment more because what we found was that between a live installation and my demo installation, there was really only a small bit that changed, like 4 bytes and the key to the credential. And those 4 bytes that changed happened to be the last 4 bytes of that key. Or it corresponded with the last 4 bytes of that key. So we started looking at things, and essentially what we found out was this is the installation ID. And the way we found it out is because they have a hard-coded admin user that uses the installation ID, and you can't change the password on it. So everyone who has a credential within your system has the password to log into your access control system. So if you now expose this on the local network, anyone can log in and change your, which is terrible in its own. But what's also then, but there's also a vulnerability with readers when it comes to MyFair Classic, where you can, with the cryptographic nonce that the reader gives out, with a few of those, you can brute force your way to the actual key. So we were starting to wondering if we could, like, first of all, what key does the reader attempt to authenticate with? Because one of them is the same across all their installations, which is also terrible, but not as bad. And then the other one is just the 4 or 6 bytes that they've assigned to your installation, which is tied to your license. Turns out they use the one that's tied to your license. So that means we now have the system ID. We also know what sector it tries to read first, because this card is kind of like a memory card, or like a, you have different sectors, as they are called, and each sector can be, can have some access control based on 2 keys that are assigned to that sector. So you can set up a quite complex installations if you have multiple use cases for the same card. You'll assign some sectors to this system, like a canteen card or something similar, and then other sectors to be used for access control. And that makes for that made that we would have some problems by just taking a valid credential and then trying to replay that with a different system ID. Because, well, we don't know how it's set up. We know what sector it tries to read first. So what we did was we did a key extraction. And there we found, well, it tries to go to the first sector. And then we did and then we just fill up the card with data on the first attempt. And then we would see where in the log of the tooling, like what sector is it trying to read next. And, well, we found out that after a bit of digging, that it doesn't really matter, because as long as you have access to, as long as you know where the first sector it tries to read is, it's just referenced on the card where to read the next one. Because we were trying some dumps that I had sent over. Miano lives in the US, so we had a few back and forths on this system. And I sent her some dumps because I didn't have a Proxmark at the time, and she tested it. And then she was like, well, that's not how this reader is supposed to work, because it's been configured differently. And turns out, well, it's all just pointed from the initial credential. So at this point, we're like, oh, we can extract the key and then just tell the card, well, please go here and read. And it sounds ridiculous when you hear about it, because it is ridiculous, where you can go up to a reader and kind of like in Hollywood movies, put a Proxmark on the reader, and then 15, 20 minutes later, you have a door that's open, and then everyone's like, well, that can't happen. So we made the proof of concept a lot quicker than the first one, because now we didn't have to care about all of these things. We could just go, oh, give me the key, and then what sector it's supposed to start with. So we made this, and at this point you can go up to the door, and within 30 seconds you have the door open. Yeah, it's also nice because it writes back which door it was to the card as a part of an audit log. So you can tell, like, if you got, well, this is door ID number 1, well, the next door is probably number 2, and then go through, like, a lot of these things very quickly. Yeah, so we spent quite a while decoding the different sectors. Here we have the user sector, which is the first one. This one defines, and this is where we figure out the thing with the keys, where you have 181E and then the key or the installation ID. What's also interesting is you can enable something they call enhanced security, which then changes 18 to 88. And then the key is some sort of algorithm from then the installation ID is encrypted with the reversible cipher. How that's encryption, that's beyond me, but we, at least we figured it out in the end that, well, you don't really need it because the card is the source of truth that lock knows. So even if you enable this enhanced security, you can downgrade it with the card. So Yeah, we decoded quite a bit of stuff from the user sector by just generating a lot of dumps with particular things changed and diffing them. So here we could see, like, we got the user ID, and this is the ID that we generate, which is fool. So if you ever come across fool in your log, I've probably been opening your door. But also what's very interesting about the user ID is the software that's used doesn't render logs for users it don't recognize. So even though it's being, or it's even worse than that, it gets dropped on the import because it doesn't have an attached user to it that it knows about. So any like entry into these sort of protected spaces are then not being logged that someone went through. And even worse than that is if you go back and you use other user IDs there is a byte which we haven't really, which I haven't shown here, that is version of this card. So a lock will only allow for the highest number version to enter through the door. So what we've experimented with and gotten quite a bit of progress on is we're actually able to lock out other people by just generating low value user IDs because they're all sequential on the doors, and then just upping that version number to, I believe it's 4 bytes, and we just put it to all Fs. At that point, your door is basically bricked. Yeah, so this is then the update on card sector, which is referenced from, or UOC block, they call it. That's basically each sector has 4 blocks, or 3 blocks of data and 1 trailing block, which contains the key. That's how it's supposed to work until you get the until it's not, because in NXP's wisdom, they decided when they made a card with more memory that you could create, that it was more beneficial in the later blocks or later sectors to have more blocks per sector, just so any attempt to make a sensible function to convert blocks to sectors just breaks, which has been kind of problematic for us during the development, because we wanted to use the 4K version because we could fit more access permissions onto those cards. So we wouldn't need to emulate like 2 different cards to get through a full installation. On a normal 1K card, I believe this is, you can fit 840 doors. So if your installation has more than 840 doors, number 1, why are you using this system? But number 2, well, I'll make another card. So we spent a little time to then decode how the access sectors worked as well. And I see I've gone through this way too quickly. But essentially what it does is it's just 2 bytes referencing what door it is, 1 nibble referencing what schedule you're supposed to be able to access the door through, because you can have up to 12 different schedules programmed into the lock. Like you can access this door between these times and stuff like that. F just is always, and then the last nibble in those 2 bytes is they just use 1 bit from what we've found, and that's either if the condition has been read by the door, because when it's read by the door, it's moved into the memory of the door and not evaluating it based on the data on the card. It will still read through, even though it knows this credential, because you might have gotten a update to then, instead of having access always, to have access never. So we spent far too long before we figured out that, well, this is just 2 bytes and then some data and then everything else. We've also spent quite a lot of time looking at some special cards, because of course you'll need a blocking card. Turns out that you can get like riot cards that you can go around with and then just block doors from everyone. And at that point, you need to either know about this card or just go around and reprogram your readers and hope that it goes away. So we've, of course, done coordinated disclosure on this. It wasn't quite a long process, and we've, with as Abloy, have now made a proper way of getting in contact with them for this brand of Abloy at least, which is TESA. If you are to find stuff like this. They've also issued a fix which requires you to then contact them and have your license upgraded, and then afterwards you'll have to then go and update all of your readers' firmware. Then you need to reissue all of your credentials, and then go over all of your readers again to then tell them that they shouldn't accept old credentials anymore. What's interesting is a lot of the deployments that I've seen are one locksmith will have one license and then use that for multiple clients. It's very common to see in blocks of flats across Oslo. You'll come across smart air readers quite often because they are cheap and an easy way of implementing access control. Well, if you can call this access control, that is. But they are fairly cheap because they don't require any of the infrastructure around, and then locksmiths, to save money, have then gotten one unlimited license and then just use that across multiple clients. Do you think those will ever get updated? Like, I've tried to tell everyone who has a tag that, hey, you need to come by us and update your credential. No, that will never be able to happen because you have a lot of key fobs that are key fobs or cards, depending on your preference, that are then being given out to external people like trash collection and services like that you'll never be able to get back to update. You could issue them new credentials, but that's kind of a more of like, yeah, it's just never gonna happen on these old installations. What's why I brought their case studies is we weren't able to find any good quantifiable numbers on how many of these installations are out there. ASA won't share it, can't imagine why. But at least they advertise these. And this is everything from hotels to schools. I've seen them used at the Oslo airport, have these readers. They require you to go and update your credential once a day. This thing bypasses that, it doesn't really matter. You can also have online readers within the system, which I haven't talked about. They still validate the data that is on the card. So even though you don't have an entry in the database, it will take your card as the source of truth and just go, yeah, you're supposed to go in here. So that's kind of where we are with this. We've shared, we have told the manufacturer about these things, and at this point it's been out for long enough that we've got new tooling that we could use. So of course we did. We managed to get the flipper to run the exploit. Through a web service, you can now go up to a door and collect the nonces, and then the sector and all of that will be shown in the mobile app. Then you just copy that over to a form, a hidden web form we made, and then you'll get a download that you can just load onto the flipper and go and open the door afterwards. So we've managed to make it even more compact at this point. So I would like to give a few attributions, and that's first of all to my co-researcher, Miana, and then everyone who's been working within RFID and hacking around that, because there are some amazing tools out there, like the Proxmark, but also other tooling. And then, everyone who's basically dug into stuff like MIFARE Classic and stuff like that. So that's what I had. And if people have questions, we have plenty of time. No? Yeah.
So just a quick question maybe for anyone else. These are used on everything. Are there other types that are used that you might come across?
So, and there are...
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, please repeat. What was the question again?
Other types of door locks like these. Is it only Oslo around, or?
No, it's not. So there are, and he asked if there are any other products like this one, and there most definitely are. One of their main competitors is Salto, which is used a lot in hotel locks. This system is also used in hotel locks. I've just, from experience, I see it more used in the blocks of flat case. There's a few others as well, like Simon's Was, and yeah, it's wrong saying it's Assa Abloy, because Assa Abloy is just buying up other companies at this point. So it's from a company called Tesa. It's then, if it's sold in the US, they'll put the multi-lock branding on it and then say, oh, well, this is a multi-lock lock now. So there's a lot of confusion when you say that, well, it's an Assa Abloy lock, but it's not Assa Abloy that's responsible for it. And that was very clear in the disclosure process as well, that these are small entities that are just under a big conglomerate, and it's the small entities that are supposed to deal with all of the disclosures and stuff like that that comes up. So yeah, there are different products. One of them actually had, which is called Scantron, had a news appearance, or had an appearance in the newspapers in Denmark about being terribly insecure and being able to copy your key fob, then do some magic to your to the data, and then write that onto a travel card that would then open your neighbor's apartment. So this is a common thing within this kind of system, it seems like, where everyone just assumes that, well, the cryptography that's used on the card is good enough, and it never is when you run your own crypto. So that, yeah. Yes?
So this is a bit of, I would ask you to speculate a little bit, but when we see these kinds of systems popping up, the people designing them aren't idiots, but they sort of seem to be idiots sometimes. Do you have any thoughts about how they end up designing systems like this?
So the question was if, like, the people who make these systems apparently aren't idiots. So, but I don't really know, to be honest. It seems, so I think a lot of it is with old systems. They relied heavily on the crypto of the credentials they used at the time, which, if you go back to the early 2000s, MyFair Classic, which this credential is called, was secure, like, because no one had looked into it. It was, per definition, from the manufacturer. They would say, well, this is a secure chip. You can store data on it, and only you can read from it. And that's a sensible assumption to take at that point, that, well, if I implement with your card, I'm assured that the confidentiality and the integrity of that is based on that key never leaking. The thing is, Barter was designed after the first flaws of MyFair Classic was released, so I don't think they get to claim that anymore. Wingcard, which is a hotel lock brand from ASSA ABLOY, gets to claim that because they were on the market way earlier. There are others like other systems like this that I've looked into that are done properly. There are a few, luckily. They will then take the data and sign it at least, and then just have a signature somewhere in there. But yeah, it seems like they are idiots, but a lot of it is they did the best with the knowledge they had at the time, it seems like. And a lot of it is still legacy, because you need to support older versions as well as you're moving upwards. There are newer card technologies as well, like MyFair Desfire is a fairly common one. It's used in most public transit systems now, where they actually use AES and not their own rolled crypto to protect the integrity of the cards. So, but then again, I see a lot of even the Desfire implementations, which seem secure, still encrypts the data before it gets written onto the card, just to avoid this in the future. So you still have the potential of cloning a credential, but you can't originate a credential. Yes?
Question, do you know if there might be any legal possibility to force a manufacturer to recall such a poorly configured product?
If it's possible for to legally force a manufacturer to recall such a product, I don't know. is the answer to it. I would love to see that being tried.
Yeah, because for me that seems to be fairly, well, the question, after your presentation, the question is what to do with this, right?
Yeah.
And if this is a problem not just for individuals, but it can affect some, airports, other sort of critical infrastructure, there should be some kind of legal solution to that, right?
Yep.
Yeah,
There.
but maybe we propose something with, some criteria which can be used to make, some kind of standards which would need to be implemented by any manufacturer to be even allowed to sell access cards.
Yeah, that's a very fair point that there should be some mechanism where you could enforce something like that. I don't know if that is the correct solution either, but in theory it sounds good. Just implementing something like that sounds like something that I'm not. That's not part of what I would be able to affect, I think. You had your hand up, right?
So in practical terms, let's say you live in an apartment building that has readers installed here and there. You've never actually looked at them, don't know the brand, don't know the underlying system, and you start wondering, is this actually secure? Where do you start? What are good resources?
So I would say start with looking at the credential with your phone, and then start Googling like the credential type, because that will give you a lot of pointers to like, has this credential been broken? Like MyForClassic, if you see, oh, MyForClassic, and then you go in Google and then you see that people have thoroughly investigated MyForClassic and are telling you it's broken. It's been broken for ages. That's one way I would look into things to start. You could also Google the brands. Sometimes you'll find presentations like this one, where someone's gone through and like shown, or you'll find research papers and stuff like that. But in general, it seems like the problem is bigger than just knowing, it seems like the problem is the locksmiths know one system and that's what they're going to push, because it's easy to manage. That's what they care about, easy to manage and physical security.
Yeah. As a user, you start with the actual key fob, read the contents of that, and then...
Correct. That's the initial way of doing it, is you start with some source of truth, which in your case would be the key fob.
Are the manufacturers happy about security researchers disclosing vulnerabilities like this?
I don't think I'm going to answer that question. Yes?
Our building recently had installed actually unlock.
Cool.
Bluetooth. What do you think about Bluetooth versus RFID?
So,
Solutions?
yeah. So what I think about Bluetooth versus RFID solutions, you mentioned I work for Unlock, which I guess I should disclose. I work with Bluetooth locks for the most part. When it comes to Bluetooth versus RFID tokens, what we see a lot, if you look at integrations on like the different systems, is that they've just taken the RFID protocol, packaged it into Bluetooth packets, and then sends that to the door. Is what we've seen a lot of manufacturers do. We use some Bluetooth-only locks, which I'm fairly confident in the security on those. Yeah, that's probably what I can say about it. I'm fairly confident in the security on it when it's those kind of meant to be Bluetooth only system. Yeah.
Suppose you're able to say which locks those are.
Oh, and their Dane locks are the ones we usually install, which I assume you've gotten. Yep. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.